Welcome, everyone, to another edition of 45 Forward, where our mission is to help you, our listeners from Los Angeles to Long Island, make your second half of life even better than the first. Now, Americans are a famously impatient people, young or older. Because achievement is so recognized and rewarded, many of us have become addicted to fast accomplishment and quick wins. We want to gain wealth or lose weight in 30 days. We press for change, faster, better, sooner, especially now as we yearn to get past COVID and get back to a normal life that feels like it's taken too long. But impatience can often compound emotional stress and anxiety, impeding clear thinking and the resolution of tough problems. In today's episode, psychologist, author, and thought leader Dr. Andrea Gould-Marks talks not only about the virtues of patience, but how to cultivate the practical skills of patience building in a time of constant impatience. Andrea is the co-author of a series of short, user-friendly booklets she calls relieflets, guides designed to provide soothing guidance during these times of turmoil. In her newly published Patience and Possibility, she provides insights into the mindset of patience, the methodology of developing better relationships and listening skills through patience, and what she calls the paradox of patience, slowing down your system, which may seem to take you off track, but actually affords you the time and flexibility to make the choices you need to weather unpredictable circumstances. And in moments of our frustration, Andrea offers some practical ways to manage the experience of time, making choices as to how to spend it wisely rather than chafing with impatience. So now let's meet our guest, Dr. Andrea Gould-Marks. Andrea, welcome back to the show.
I am. How long has it been, Ron? Since maybe at the beginning of your show?
It is. So last February. Well, I'll remind the listeners during our first break when our last show was. You had a terrific show last February 3rd about lifelong friendships. So
Very
that's,
important.
yeah, that was a great show as well. So yes, as I was saying, we are a famously or notoriously known culture for impatience, getting things done, just do it. That famous Nike slogan. But particularly now coming out of the pandemic, with so much in that in mind, let's just go right actually to the title of your book. How did you pick this title? Patience and possibility, and this. Explain a little bit about this whole notion of relieflets.
Okay. The notion of relieflets to address discomforts, right?
Right.
And as a psychologist, the kinds of discomforts that permeate from the outside in as well as from the inside out. And so, with respect to your question about how the idea of patience and possibility itself emerged, it was during the pandemic
Hmm.
that I was observing that very tendency to begin to even just unconsciously absorb the impatience that seemed to permeate all the discussions in the media.
Right.
And particularly right at the outset, there was a discussion of the possibility of vaccine. And so, being from the generation that knew about vaccines, I was eager to see what the process would be of creating one. And then the conversation in the culture was, where is the vaccine already? It was only just mentioned last week, but we don't have the vaccine yet. And there was a collective demand for that to be established kind of right away. And it came to me that, boy, this is really a good time to cultivate a little patience because
Right.
there's a process involved in creating a
Right.
vaccine.
Right.
And so it also brought me to the fact that many people do not appreciate process.
Hmm. Hmm.
That given whatever it is, things take time to evolve.
Right.
And so, yeah, that kind of grabbed me, and I said, this would be a good idea to kind of bring this concept forward a little bit, so that at least it could be in our awareness.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I think you and I have talked before about the ex- how we experience time and patience is different. People have different senses of experience, and so I remember talking to someone during the pandemic about, hey, let's just get all together. We're all in the same boat, and as you and I have said before, well, we're actually traveling down the same river, but we're on different boats. We're not on the
Yes,
same boat down that river. So the
yes.
experiences are different for people. Um, but there are ways to deal with it. And reading through your relief lit, I found a lot of very practical, useful information about patience and really kind of dissecting what it was. I found it very useful to kind of let's look at, well, what is it exactly we're talking about? So let's talk a little bit about that. About how you look at patience, how do you define it, and how do we break it apart, its elements, so that we can, use it in different ways.
That was so much fun to do for me as an intellectual exercise, because there's the philosophical aspect of it, there's the pragmatic aspect of it, there's the functional aspect that leads to solutions. But basically, it was Freud, I think, many many scores of years ago, who talked about delay of gratification. And that is really something that we learn in psychology school. It's like the first thing.
Right.
Second thing, maybe we learn is about delay of gratification.
Hmm.
That is something that Freud noticed that was a problem for people. And even then, in the early 20th century, there was this impulse to pleasure. I mean, a lot of it was underground, but it was this impulse toward gratifying needs. And we have that. We all have that. It's
Right.
just that the things we need have become different, more urgent, and more compelling.
Right.
And so our ability to regulate our outflow of energy and focus and emotions are really the components of patience.
Right. Right. And I think that, there certainly is some influence of technology and sort of the technological mentality of, sort of instant gratification, and some of it is certainly gratifying. I mean, when you have something that you can't think of the answer, you've forgotten an actor's name, or you forgot the name of that, what was that movie, you can go to Google and boom, you get it. Like, okay, I don't need to, suffer for 5 hours trying to remember what this was, or have to go to the library or something. You can find out. So there certainly is that notion, as you've mentioned to me before, about if to satisfy the curiosity in our intellect, it's a very good aspect to it.
It's
However,
excellent. Yes.
yeah, it
Well,
does create expectations that are sometimes very unrealistic.
and expectations always create some kind of stress.
Hmm.
Sometimes there's eustress, EU stress,
Hmm.
which is good stress. It's motivational stress.
Right.
More often than not, the impatience of waiting for something. And I was just thinking, as you were giving the example of how wonderful technology can be, I was thinking that back in the day, we would wait for letters from people we loved, and it would be weeks, or it would be
Right.
in our growing up, it could be days. If they sent it from California and it arrived in New York, maybe 3 days, 5 days, something like
Right.
that.
Right.
Love letters, right? So now you can barely wait for some of the three dots on the texting to to see, and with bated breath, as they say.
Right.
So that's a really good example of how technology and the development of it has really driven
Right.
a
Right.
very pervasive sense of impatience in our
Right.
culture. That's now the norm.
Right. Right.
You know,
And
you,
and it's
yeah.
been progressive too. So we think of it mostly in the last few years, but it really has been, going on for quite some time. I remember working with a person, a public relations person in the mid '80s, 1980s, who she would submit proposals to potential clients about getting this or getting that done, or so forth. And I remember her telling me, it used to be where you did a proposal, and then you did it and you sent it off, and then you had a little time, and then they sent a response back, and then maybe had a phone conversation, maybe this went back and forth. She said, now this damn fax machine now makes expectations that you got to get back to me today, and it's just like, most, I think a lot of younger people today probably don't even know what a fax machine is.
Oh,
um,
yes.
yes, so there has been an accelerating pace to impatience, And there are a couple of definitions that you quoted in your booklet. I found very very interesting and useful. So one of them was from a man named David Allen, and he says patience is the calm acceptance of things that happen in a different order than you once had in mind. Was what.
Right, right. Little, yeah, a little wry.
Right. Yes.
Right.
And the other one was from a woman named Joyce Meyer. That is, patience is not the ability to wait, but the ability to keep a good attitude while waiting, which I
Yeah.
thought was also a useful way of looking at it.
Yes. And then I remember saying that it's about regulating our thoughts and our feelings, our
Right.
emotions and our impulses. And that's what I was saying before in terms of breaking it up when we were writing it into its component parts. There was the philosophical, the poetic,
Hmm.
and the functional. And then, of course, over the past, I don't know, half a century, I guess, there has really been tremendous research into how the brain works,
Hmm.
into neuropsychology and brain science.
Hmm.
And that has been very helpful in creating a more granular understanding of the different parts of the brain involved in processing information, processing experience.
Hmm.
And at the same time, there's been this development of spiritual wisdom, which has merged itself into psychology and then merged itself into New Age lingo and that kind of thing. But there are components of spirituality, particularly Eastern spirituality,
Hmm.
that have really added to the robust nature of getting a grip
Right.
on patients.
Right. Right. Yeah. That whole move in meditation and mindfulness, right? Kind of merging with what's happening in your brain. Yeah. Yeah.
Even Zen.
Hmm. Right, right. Um, so some of the little exercises that you use I think are interesting too. So you have what you call a patience quotient to sort
Yes,
of
a
test yourself
PQ.
of what is your level of patience. Tell
Yes.
us a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, a lot of this comes from my own self-observation,
Hmm.
which I couldn't be who I am today unless I had put myself under a microscope.
Right.
So, beginning with observing the times where I feel impatient, I'm a great barometer because I am by nature or my evolution has been into an impatient.
Hmm.
I have a large component of impatience.
Right.
That was great because I could find it. I could find it when I'm putting on my running shoes. I could find it when I'm making coffee. I could find it with the shortcuts that I think I'm taking by doing multitasking, by a couple of things at a time. So I've kind of experienced it phenomenologically, just going through my day from the very beginning of why am I feeling like I need to race to put on my running shoes? What is the difference between 6:39 a.m. and maybe 6:42 a.m.,
Hmm.
if that, or 6:39.3? So it has gotten, like I said, to such a granular level that the breath, our breathing, is our first defense against the stress. We could say that breath, is a friend to reducing stress.
Right.
And the minute we could really take a really deep inhale and a couple of those deep inhales and exhales, we actually slow down everything that needs to be slowed down.
Right. Right.
But we need to do it consciously and purposefully
Right.
so
Right.
that we can begin to pair the little places, the micro places where we feel impatient,
Right.
and carry that all the way through to the larger places where we feel impatient with ourselves, or
Right.
we can't retrieve a document, or someone hasn't called us back.
Right.
So
Right.
there's a spectrum.
Right. Yeah. But I think that's a very useful starting point is to just identify what are the moments that, the situational circumstances that make you impatient or whether it makes you impatient, that you are impatient. And then, of course, the flip side of that, you've mentioned to me is circumstances when you feel the opposite. You feel like you have endless patience. And these are moments that, of just a different experiential sense of time.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that. The thing that I just thought of is I recently got a kitten.
Hmm.
And half the time I'm asking myself, why did you have to get this kitten? This kitten is a big inconvenience. This is a big take you off task. This is all these things that are the opposite of, cultivating ease, etc. But then there's something about holding a kitten, listening to the kitten purr, taking the deep breaths. You can't rush an animal.
Right.
You really can't. It's like chop chop. Okay, let's go. Having to do, like one of my clients once said to me, they have a life of their own. And
Right.
they do. And they live in a different time zone. So
Right.
that's been a very rewarding bypass, if you will, of my own personal impatience.
Yeah.
But I also think that the value of observing impatience is that it gives you many trials to see if you can change the habit.
Right.
And
Right.
the more trials and the more rewards we have, the more we strengthen the habit. So if we obey our stress and impatience, which is really easy to do, all it does is strengthen the impatience habit
Right. Right.
and vice versa.
Yeah, right. So that's right. So that's the first step is identifying it. And but then the other thing is to consciously sort of shift at those moments, at the trigger moments, and seeing you can change that habit. It's like I guess, people talk about the powers of habits. That's one of the key things. And impatience is I think we have to think about it really as a habit, not so much as, well, that's I'm just impatient, you
Well,
know.
that's a very important distinction, is that people will describe themselves as impatient, which means in the course of their day or their life, there are many circumstances, one after another, that strengthen that habit.
Right.
When we wrote the first relieflet called Relief from Worrying, I think pretty much the first thing we say at the beginning is that worrying is a habit.
Right. Right.
And all of the recent research supports that it's a habit.
Right.
And impatience is a habit. And so if a habit can be grown, then a habit can be changed.
Right.
All
Right.
we have to do is use a new habit to counteract the old habit.
Right.
But there's one caveat: we must move first to intention. We
Right.
have we have to agree that it's worthwhile
Right.
to do this. That's
Great.
the intention.
Great. Great. So we're going to hold on to that. I'm going to curb my impatience to find the answer to that. But we're going to take a quick break, folks. When we come back, we'll be talking much more with psychologist Dr. Andrea Gould-Marks about the practice of patience. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back, folks, where we're talking today with Dr. Andrea Gould-Marks about how to practice patience in a society that often supports the opposite, impatience. Now, before we continue, I wanted to let you know you can find out much more information about Andrea and her first two relieflets, Relief from Worrying and Patience and Possibility, by going to her website, boomtalkradio.com. That's BOOM, boomtalkmedia.com. And you can also, if you want to go on the Voice America site or my site, roelresources.com, you can listen to our previous show last February 3rd about how to maintain friendship across our lifespans. Very interesting conversation. So you can listen to both this broadcast and previous ones. So before the break, Andrea, we were talking about, you know, uh, di- experiencing patience in different ways. And I wanted to talk to you about a notion that you mentioned in your booklet about what you call the patience paradox. Tell us what that's about.
Well, I think that we believe that if we hurry up, we're going to get there faster, and maybe we'll even be more efficient. But the truth of the matter is that unless we break the cycle of impatience, and unless we stop, actually say stop and break the cycle and cease some of the frenetic activity that actually interferes with the quality of what we're wanting to do, um, it's a false illusion to think that hurrying up is really going to improve life. As a matter of fact, there's that old joke that as we get closer to the end, it's like a roll of toilet paper. The closer to the end we get, the faster it goes.
Right,
And that's
right,
another factor that we just need to keep in our awareness. But the paradox is that how we perceive, I like to say, how we perceive of something is how we proceed. So if we tell ourselves that we have all the time we actually need to create something or to perform a task, and we regulate our breathing, we can do this with far more equanimity and far more peace. And the effects of stress are actually compounded. It isn't healthy. It's unhealthy to be as stressed as we do make ourselves, because there's a whole cascade of other things that occur to us as we seek to reduce our stress, which
Right.
takes us off task. So there's a lot of paradoxical threads that are woven together in that notion. But
Right.
certainly stopping to take stock of what's going on, what's necessary, what's the hurry. There's another expression that, hurrying is because of worrying, and worrying is because of fear. And what's the fear underneath all of this?
Right.
So those are questions to ask ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think in those moments you can really stop and just sort of, yeah, as you said, you can take a pause or you take a breath, whatever, metaphorically you want term you want to say, to think about, well, let's take a moment and rethink this and take the time to process this. That may seem, but yeah, so you're on the one hand, you've got this other, side of you saying, gotta hurry, gotta finish. But if you take time to really think more about it, um, you know, the clarity unfolds. And I think that, it reminds me of years ago, I took a course in consensus building and collaboration. And one of the things that the well, I guess he was really a mentor, taught me was about, that people often uh, shied away from collaboration and just sort of went right to voting, like, well, let's just vote on this. And what he said was that, well, what happens is when you vote on it, there are winners and losers. And what happens, and they don't do it because they fear it's going to take more time. Just want to get through this. But the reality is, it takes as much time or more time on the back end because the voting creates a process where the losers basically get ticked off and proceed on a process of, recidivism, and obstruction.
Yeah.
So that the time you take to really, that requires some patient negotiation, really makes the overall process, in fact, faster.
And there's that old adage that life is a journey, not a destination.
Right.
I was in my 20s when I heard that. And I thought, okay, I hung a big poster behind my desk. I was a school psychologist at the time. And
Hmm.
I thought this would be a really good notion to have on hand, because like we were talking about at the beginning, things take time. There's a process. And for those who want to skip over the process, there is a negation of intelligent thoughtfulness, reasoning, learning how things actually work. Let's go back to the vaccine.
Okay.
To hurry up the vaccine would be not to understand um, how a vaccine is made, or that it has to be tested, or that it has to be tested over time. You want a vaccine made yesterday and you put it in your arm today? I don't know. Not such a
Right.
good idea. I like to see how a couple of weeks do, a couple of months do, etc. So when you go back over it, you see that a lot of times impatience is an indication that there is a lack of learning, a lack of education about what creates a process like you were just describing, what creates a successful, let's say, team,
Right. Right.
team experience on
Right.
solving a problem. And that is collaboration, because it upfront deals with the potential issues.
Right.
So I think education is a big part of it. Science education, in particular, historical education
Right.
as
Right.
well.
Yeah. Yeah. It teaches you about the essential aspect of sometimes taking your time to really work through things. Now, one of the things I like too, Andrea, about your leaflet is that you, again, as I said before, you break things down. And so one of the things that I found interesting was talking about relationships. And so relationships take time too. And even some things that, I can't tell you how many business courses I've taken in listening, active listening, but you break it down in an interesting way in terms of looking at the sort of the relationship between patience and listening. So tell me a little bit more about that, about sort of the
Hmm.
steps that you've identified.
Yeah, well, like you're saying, going back to what you were saying about voting, there's polarization lots of times when we're
Hmm.
having a conversation with someone. I think this, you think that, or you think that, you think I think this. And so we jump to conclusions
Right.
and we don't resolve. And not only don't we resolve, we then build discomfort in the presence of the other person. So this isn't a comfortable person
Right.
because this person is pressing me for an answer, or this isn't a comfortable conversation for me to have. So, I think that listening, like I said, is in the book is a example of patience tolerance
Mm.
or tolerance for patience. And I do a lot of listening. It's part of my career as a psychologist.
Right.
Um, and so I went through my own process and just the bullet points, and each
Hmm.
one of the bullet points has a whole family of little bullet points within
Right.
it. But the
Sub
first
bullets.
one, right, is to let the other person talk first to the logical stopping point. So I say, listen first.
Right.
And how do we do that? We have to still our body and our mind. Our mind and our body are connected. And so the best way to do that is by breathing,
Hmm.
because breathing unites the mind and the body, which is just a great tool. And we
Right.
can go into further depth about it. And then we have to, as we're listening and as we still the body and mind, we're letting the other person finish. Very
Mhm.
important,
Right.
And I think sometimes I'm accused of being a New Yorker
Huh.
because there's something in the culture of New York, the epicenter of speed it up. Because
Right.
now I live in the Southwest, which is catching up,
Right.
but still it's not the going thing, whereas New York is definitely the going thing. And so to be able to slow down enough and create the space to listen for a pause, we use the word pregnant pause,
Right.
to listen for the pause. And then how about this? To check, to understand,
Right.
to check that you've understood, which is not just a straight paraphrase, but to communicate that not only have you heard, but that what the other person was saying makes sense.
Right.
And sometimes you have to dig deep, but it depends what you want out of the conversation. If you want to
Right.
have a fight, then there's a whole different route that
Right.
you can take,
Right.
right? You want to win, another whole route to take. But if you care about the person with whom you're having the conversation, and most often in my case, it's usually doing counseling sessions with couples or parents and children and parents and adult children, where we really need to put the magnifying glass on this kind of a conversation.
Yeah. And I
So
think
there's
it,
a couple of steps.
yeah, and I think so that last step I think is a good point in the sense of you're both clarifying for yourself that you in fact understood what the person was saying, and you're also acknowledging to that person that you've really heard them.
It's
You
the
may not
ultimate,
agree with them, but you've heard them. You know what they're saying.
the
Yeah.
ultimate respect.
Right. 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 Yeah. Yeah. So let's get back to a little bit more in depth about, changing the habit of impatience. So you mentioned that earlier in our conversation. So the first thing, of course, is that you mentioned is catching yourself in the habit, and then purposely slowing down. What next? What are the steps after that?
Well, catching yourself in the habit, first of all, you need to be paying attention to the cues in your body.
Hmm.
Okay. So, doing something clumsily, for instance, or catching your breathing, or catching yourself not even being present to the current task,
Yeah.
but rather thinking about whatever the next step is.
Right.
So there's a technology to catching yourself. And pretty soon you get to really recognize that when your heart starts beating fast, or you start moving without clarity, or you're not catching your, and you're catching yourself not being present, then so it starts there,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then the slowing down part comes with practicing breathing. And I can't recommend highly enough. There's so many. If you Google breathing, all you have to do is Google breathing, and there will be so many. There's so many apps. There's an adorable app that looks like a circle. So when you breathe in, the circle expands.
Mm.
And then you breathe out, the circle shrinks back. It's a visual cue to really pace you. And then there are countless mindfulness meditation apps or mindful breathing apps. So now we live in a world where we've imported the spiritual technology of meditation, and we've broken it into the tiny little habits that a person can just simply do by themselves, anywhere, anytime,
Yeah.
anytime, right? So that's the second is, and then it's associating. So let's say you rapidly go through making your smoothie in the morning, and you do this and you do that, and you spill some stuff on the counter, and you put it in, and you didn't tie it tight, you didn't make the cap tight enough, so the whole thing makes a mess on the kitchen counter. Sometimes we can get sloppy when we're racing,
Yeah.
or when we're moving too quickly.
Yeah.
Not to mention, we can bump our car into the car in front of us, or
Yeah.
something more,
Yeah.
more
Yeah. Yeah.
violent even.
Yeah. I think sometimes, there is a social dimension that we, don't acknowledge. And maybe it's more so in New York. I don't know about here, but elsewhere. But I think certainly I catch myself in conversations, not listening because I'm focusing on what am I going to say next? What's my response going to be? And I think, there's just a little bit of anxiety that comes in about, well, what if I have nothing to say about this? Or what if I, don't know how to respond? And, afraid of any, talk about pregnant pauses, afraid of any pauses in the conversation, as if
Yeah,
that's going to be something terrible. And it
right,
just gives us, a chance to all kind of like, take a breath and kind of, laugh or kind of look at each other for a second. And I think I do think that I have been in some circumstances where I'm with, two or three other people in collective conversations, and people are just, I don't think intention, but sort of jumping on top of each other. You can
oh god,
hardly break into the conversation. I'm like, hey guys, relax a little bit. Let people finish before getting out your thought. It'll be
right.
there in 3 seconds. Yes, okay.
Well, two
Um,
things you mentioned very really important: anxiety being the basis of almost everything, is having that anxious feeling of having to perform,
mhm,
having to contribute,
right.
having to be smart, having to be competitive. So that's one thing. The other is that I learned about this a very, very long time ago in teaching learning.
Mm,
And at the bottom of every page, I do believe it was an Israeli psychologist, and on the bottom of every page, he wrote, "Let me think."
mm, interesting.
you know and so if somebody is demanding an answer, you can say, "Let me think." Here's another example. The kid gets into trouble and comes home and knows that there's not going to be good consequence. All right, what are you going to do to me? How are you going to punish me? Right?
Right.
Am I going to be grounded? Am I going to have my technology removed? What are you going to do? And the parent says something like, let me think about this. I'll let you know tomorrow morning.
Mm,
Whoa. There's a whole lot of stuff that comes from that within, let's just say, the child himself or herself,
right.
but also that, the parent is showing self-respect to themselves. We show respect to ourselves when we say, I need to think about that. Interesting. I don't have an immediate response. I know you, Ron, to be such a thoughtful person. And I can extrapolate from there. And very often, very thoughtful people don't want to respond right away because they haven't finished thinking it through, you
Yeah.
know. So impatience plays itself out in the social arena, like you're saying.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think too that some of that is a little fear about judgment, right? If you don't have a response, well, why not? You're not thinking fast enough. You're not a quick thinker, not a person of action. How come you don't
Right.
answer? And
Exactly.
and I think that the response is some things take some thought to think through. I'm not going to give you an answer. I think that's one of the things people talk about in negotiation theory, right? Don't allow yourself to get caught in a time trap of having to respond with other people's expectations. But it's not just that; it's that they things clearly do take some time to think through sometimes. So um, so I'm gonna talk shift a little bit to some of the patience building activities we've talked about before, but we'll probably have to do it on both sides of the break. But let's where I'm heading is I think you've talked about some things just like you mentioned about one activity is just playing with your kitten, as a means of acknowledging patience of that you're not always in control every second. Just relax about it. um but so after the break, what I'd like to come back and talk about some of the other activities that you mentioned in your leaflet, like gardening or cooking or doodling or things like that. So folks, we're going to come back after a quick break again with Dr. Andrea Gould-Marks. So don't go away. We have a packed last section to cover, a lot of stuff. Welcome back, folks. We're talking with Dr. Andrea Gould-Marks about patience, the practice of it, and the possibilities of doing it more. So before the break, we were talking about some of the activities and practices that can help you, sort of reinforce the idea of patience. And some of the things that you've mentioned to me before are things that sort of break you out, like cooking or gardening or fishing or being in nature. So talk about some of these things. I know some of them you do personally. So what are the things that people can think about to help them break them out of their impatience?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that if we adopt a mindset
Hmm.
of patience, so a mindfulness mindset, just to say to ourselves, give ourselves the command. Here's a mindful mindset. That means I'm going to be staying in the present very, very consciously, like I have to if I am planting, or if I am following a recipe, or if I am playing the piano for the first time in 20 years. Some of those, if I am writing something, if I'm writing a thank you note,
Hmm.
if I'm composing, those activities require a mindfulness mindset or
Hmm.
patience mindset. And then we can decide if we're trying to connect, or if we want to inspire, or if we want to be creative. Those are mindsets that flow out of a patient's mindset. But I think it's also spiritually the willingness to see an unusual time as an opportunity to do something that we're not necessarily used to doing. So to go back to the pandemic and what you were noticing is that there were so many things that people did who were fortunate enough to be able to take the time to do, reconnecting with old friends,
Right.
picking up a piece of art that they'd started, a piece of writing that they had started years ago. Spending more time in nature, by the way, which is the most universal, because we can't control nature. We can control how fast we walk, but that's about it, or run. But we
Right.
can't control how fast the sun sets or rises, or what the trees are going to be doing in their photosynthesis journey of gaining the chlorophyll and losing the
Right.
chlorophyll. So
Right.
the powers that we have of being outside, the
Mhm.
Japanese have something called Oh, I don't remember the Japanese.
Shrin-yoku, right? You mentioned
Okay,
it.
thank you. Yeah, Shirin-yoku, which is forest bathing. Shrinyan being the forest part and
Right.
yoku being the bathing part. And the actual chemical effect
Mhm.
of what goes on in a forest and how it affects us through our skin,
Right.
through our olfaction, etc. So we have in the booklet a whole list of things like chess.
Right.
I mean, it would seem crazy to have that all speeded up, or doing things with your left hand or with your non-dominant hand, as seeing how
Hmm.
long it takes to do it with your non-dominant hand, or tackling a really thick book and seeing just getting through it by reading 2 or 3 pages at a time, even
Right.
though it's a 600-page book. Um, Gardening, cooking, playing a musical instrument, building something, teaching a baby,
Right. Yeah.
toilet training a kitten.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
All those
Yeah.
things.
Exactly. Yeah. So being present in the moment, moment after moment after moment.
And the reason that these things, the long list in our leaflet, is that they have their own intrinsic rewards. If patience wasn't ultimately rewarding, it would be even more challenging to
Hmm.
adopt a new habit. But
Right.
because if you allow yourself
Right.
to choose something that is associated with a patient mindset, and then you see the result of it, or you see the result of it in a loved one who finally feels heard, or
Hmm.
there's a shift in the level of respect and therefore compliance in the relationship, then it's a reward. Then we get to do it more,
Right.
easier to
Right.
repeat it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that some of it is, especially with respect to this show, 45 Forward, there is a relationship to developing patience, a certain kind of patience as you get older, through the experience of living, I think. Um, that doesn't mean that as a young person, you can't be patient. It's sometimes a little harder, perhaps, but partly because you don't have experiences, so you don't know what the expectation should be. But so I think that you've talked to me in the past about not always waiting, but just understanding the difference between evolutionary sort of you know voluntary versus involuntary change, and how you know the it does require some patience to figure out which one to do. At what point do you take action or and change things, right?
Yeah, yeah. And so there's a wide spectrum of things, I mean, the patience of understanding that things take time. On the other hand, the impulse to help, like in our world situation right
Right.
now, there's things that we cannot do or we can't even fathom doing. And yet there are small things that we can do. So certainly activism has its own spectrum, going from impatient activism to more patient activism.
Right.
Um, and also how, for instance, on a very personal level, how our own creativity or productivity has changed over time, and how
Right.
we have an increased capacity as we age to, if we have the capacity to reflect and use it, we can see where we were, perhaps, like you talk about Louise Erdrich in her writing and her novels, that she's able to stand back and assess what she's doing in a
Right.
way that, now that she's older, that she didn't have that. How far back can you stand?
Right.
If you're 23 years old, you can only
Right.
go back a little bit, right?
Right.
Whereas if you're 70 years old, you can go back way and get that perspective.
Right.
And that's something else that we gain as we age, is the perspective and also the perception of what's important and what's less important. Um, you and I spoke a little bit about baseball, that people think baseball
Right.
is too slow. It's my favorite spectator sport,
Yeah.
just because you can see what's going on, as opposed to football, where there's a pile of people and then, like, what
Yeah.
happened?
Yeah.
Now at least they have instant replay, so you can see
Right.
what happened. But
Right. Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, I agree. I think yes. I've it's a different experience for me watching baseball and versus other sports. And sometimes if you're looking for more action, yes, it's like, well, this is slow. But for me, that's the enjoyable part. I can get to relax. I can kind of look and reflect. It is a slower sport. It does require a lot more reflection. There's a lot of other things going on. There's people stepping in out of the batter's box. There are pitchers, so, but and I do think it's sort of telling that um, it'll be interesting to see how much the sport changes because people, the people who oversee the game are now trying to speed up the games. Like, okay,
Yeah.
you only have a certain number of time to make a pitch. You have you can't make that many pitchers change in an inning. Um, they've stopped now, but then during the pandemic times, right? If you had a double header, then they were shortening it to 7 innings. So there's this concern about the fans being impatient, and I think that they have to be careful about changing the nature of the sport to so much that it's like, well, then you're just going to make it like other sports that's not trying to be like. This is what makes
New
it
role
distinctive.
baseball. Yeah,
Yeah.
well, they could change it to a video game and take
Yeah,
care of
that's
it all
right.
that way.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
sure.
That's right.
As
Yeah.
many things are changed
Right.
to video games, or a
Yeah.
lot of physical therapy these days takes place.
Right.
You used to have to drive to the
Right.
physical therapy
Right.
place.
Yeah.
You could tell that we're the older generation where physical therapy becomes a thing that we do along with
Hmm.
eating, cooking,
Right. Physical
in the
therapy.
theater, working, physical therapy, but it's that same kind of the translation of what used to be life
Right.
into the new container for life, which is now technological container.
Right.
So we definitely have challenges in front of us.
Right.
We definitely do. And I think that I would love people to take a look at the little book because it was written with impatience in mind.
Hmm.
And as many of my readers have mentioned, that you could pick up the book and start anywhere and put it down in 60 seconds or 2 minutes and feel satisfied that you've read a nugget. It's arranged more
Right.
nugget wise as
Right.
opposed to reading a whole book. And I
Right.
think that happened unconsciously.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
didn't set out to make little nuggets.
Right.
I
Right.
set out to write about patience, and it
Yeah.
came out that way
Yeah.
because I've been trained,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
right? Pay attention to attention.
Right, right. So just to go back to what you were mentioning before, Louise Erdrich, this novelist. So just so people would know that. So we were referring to. I read an interesting interview with her when she was talking about. She said one thing about aging is that you have the greater ability to synthesize information. I can finish things now that I started 20, 30 years ago, but didn't have the wherewithal back then to complete. So I think that you do gain some wisdom with aging. You learn how to make decisions about things. I just wanted to mention, go back to one thing you said earlier about you have all the time you need. And I found that striking because I do remember some time ago having a conversation with my wife about, being overwhelmed and stressed out about getting things done and how we're going to do this and that. And that was her comment. She said, you have all the time you need, but you need to make choices about how to spend that time.
Right.
And that's sort of an interesting comment about patience, about, so it does require making decisions, but taking some reflection to make those decisions and giving yourself that time to do it. So
A
um,
wise woman, your wife,
she
right?
is, she
And
is.
it is true that sometimes we can get caught in thinking that things. I learned from you when you were a journalist in your other career.
Hmm.
It was like, how does he write a whole new thing every day? Because he has to.
Right,
Okay.
right,
Right.
right,
So,
right. Yeah,
I remember saying, how do you start? How do you do that?
right.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. So parameters are good.
Yes. Talking about parameters, I'm sorry to say that we have flown by this hour, and I just wanted to, before we end, just to quickly thank you so much for coming on today, Andrea, for a terrific, thought-provoking conversation. If people have missed it, you can still catch it if you go to voiceamerica.com and searching for my show 45 Forward. You can also hear it on Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and wherever you listen to your podcast, probably. So if you want to send me comments or questions, you can email me at ron.roel@gmail.com. Meanwhile, folks, be sure to join me next Monday, 12 noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, when I'll be talking with Linda Fostek, a crisis planner, and Don Patain, a financial advisor. We will be talking about what we've learned coming out of the pandemic about how to better prepare for future crises yet unknown. So, folks, until then, I'll be looking forward to 45 Forward with all of you.
Thank you.